250 miles north of the quarries that gave Egypt its finest red granite, there is a room that most visitors to Abydos never see. It sits behind one of the most celebrated temples in the country, sunk below the level of the surrounding desert, and today it holds standing water all year round. 10 massive granite piers rise out of that water, and resting on them are horizontal beams of stone so heavy that modern engineers still stop to do the arithmetic twice. There is no paint on these walls, no crowded relief, no procession of gods, none of the visual noise that fills every other New Kingdom temple in Egypt. Just naked stone, joined with a precision that unsettled the very people who first uncovered it. This is the Osireion, and its story is not the story of aliens or a lost supercivilization, whatever the internet may tell you. It is stranger than that, in the way that real archaeology is often stranger than the legend built on top of it. It is a story about how a monument can be misread by trained experts, corrected a generation later by even more careful work, and still leave behind a residue of genuine mystery that no textbook has fully closed. To understand what makes this place strange, you first have to understand where it stands. Abydos was, for well over 3,000 years, the most sacred site in Egypt tied to death and the afterlife. It was here that the earliest kings of the First Dynasty, ruling around 3000 BCE, were laid to rest in the desert cemetery known today as el-Quayab. In time, the Egyptians came to believe that one of those ancient royal tombs was the actual burial place of Osiris, the god who died, was resurrected, and ruled the underworld. 4 millennia afterward, pilgrims traveled to Abydos specifically to be close to that story. Kings wanted their names associated with this ground because nowhere else in Egypt carried the same weight of sanctity. Rising above the desert at the heart of this landscape is the Temple of Seti I, a spectacular building dated with total confidence to around 1290 to 1279 BCE. Every wall inside is carved and painted. It contains the famous Abydos king list, the sequence of royal names Egyptologists still use to help reconstruct the order of the pharaohs. There is no controversy about who built the Temple of Seti I, why, or how. It is a documented, dated, unambiguous royal monument. Directly behind that temple, reached by a long descending passage, sits the structure we are talking about. Where the temple in front is loud with decoration, the chamber behind it is almost silent. 10 granite pillars, square and plain, support horizontal stone lintels known as architraves, some of which are estimated to weigh in the range of many tens of tons. The joints between the blocks are famously tight enough that visitors and early excavators alike described being unable to work a knife blade into the seam. There is no mortar. The building sits low enough that groundwater has flooded its central hall, leaving a raised stone platform, often called the Osiris bed, rising out of the water like an island. It looks, at first glance, like nothing else built in the New Kingdom. And that visual shock is exactly what confronted the archaeologists who dug it out of the sand at the start of the 20th century. The site was first cleared in 1902 and 1903 under Flinders Petrie, working with his wife Hilda Petrie and a young researcher named Margaret Murray. It was Murray who documented what they had found and published an early account in 1904, and she came away with a strong instinct that the structure predated the dynasties as they were then understood. A decade later, the Egyptian Exploration Fund resumed work at the site under the direction of the respected Swiss Egyptologist Edouard Neville, who published his own account in 1914. Neville, too, concluded that the building looked and felt older than the temple standing in front of it. These were not casual observers. Petrie is often called the father of scientific archaeology in Egypt, and Murray went on to a long and influential career in her own right. When people with that pedigree looked at the Osireion and said it did not sit comfortably in the period everyone assumed it belonged to, that reaction deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. But it is worth being honest about what that reaction actually was. It was an impression formed from the visual character of the stone and the awkward placement of some inscriptions, not from a systematic excavation of the building's foundations. Neville himself, by his own later admission, based his dating largely on how the architecture looked rather than on stratigraphic evidence dug up from underneath it. That distinction matters, because roughly 2 decades later a far more rigorous investigation arrived to test the question directly. Between 1925 and 1929, the archaeologist Henri Frankfurt took over the excavation of the Osireion on behalf of the Egypt Exploration Society, and he did something the earlier teams had not done as thoroughly. He excavated the actual foundation trenches beneath the walls. He tracked the pottery and construction debris embedded in the layers the builders themselves had cut into and then backfilled while raising the structure. What he found, published in his definitive 1933 study, The Cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos, was foundation deposits and construction fill consistent with the 19th dynasty, the same period as the temple standing in front of it. In other words, when someone finally checked the ground the building was rooted in, rather than only the stone rising out of it, the evidence pointed back to Seti I after all. It was this stratigraphic work, not simply a change of fashion or a more convenient story, that shifted the scholarly consensus. Frankfurt's excavation is still the most exhaustive study of the Osireion ever conducted, and it remains the foundation of the accepted dating today. So why does the building look so radically different from the temple beside it if they were raised by the same king in the same decades? This is where the real mystery lives, and it is a genuine one, because the standard explanation, while reasonable, is an interpretation rather than a document Seti I left behind explaining his own intentions. The scholarly reading is that the Osireion was built as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, dedicated to Osiris himself, and possibly designed to evoke the primeval mound of creation described in Egyptian cosmology, the first patch of dry land said to have emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. Under this reading, the deliberately archaic, unornamented, massively megalithic style was a choice, meant to make the building feel ancient and eternal rather than to blend it stylistically with the ornate temple of Seti's own reign. The flooding of the central hall, on this account, may not be purely an accident of a rising water table. It may echo, intentionally or not, the mythological image of the primordial waters surrounding a rising island of first land, embodied physically by the platform the excavators nicknamed the Osiris bed. It is an elegant reading. It also cannot be proven with certainty, because no inscription found at the site spells out the builder's symbolic intentions in so many words. What we have is architecture and pottery, and the rest is informed interpretation built on top of it. There are still details at the Osireion that resist a completely tidy explanation, and it is worth naming them honestly rather than either exaggerating them into proof of a lost civilization or pretending they don't exist. The granite used in the structure is red Aswan granite, quarried roughly 250 miles south of Abydos and transported down the Nile, the same kind of stone the Egyptians used for obelisks, sarcophagi, and the finest architectural elements of their most important buildings. Moving stone of that size and weight over that distance was an extraordinary logistical undertaking even by the standards of a civilization famous for exactly this kind of feat. And while the broader Egyptian record of moving obelisks and colossal statues gives us a general sense of the methods available, ropes, sledges, prepared trackways, and Nile barges, the specific engineering steps used for the Osireion's architraves were not written down in any surviving text we have found. That is not evidence of an unknown builder. It is simply a gap in the historical record, the kind of gap that exists for a great many ancient Egyptian construction projects whose day-to-day methods were never documented for posterity. The Egyptians rarely wrote engineering manuals. They wrote about the gods, about kingship, about conquest and devotion. The absence of a "how we did it" inscription at the Osireion is consistent with that broader pattern, not a red flag unique to this one building. The joints between the blocks are indeed remarkably tight, and this precision has become one of the most repeated claims about the site, that a knife blade cannot be slipped between the stones. Precise dry-fitted masonry of exactly this kind appears at other confirmed Egyptian sites as well, including in Old Kingdom Valley temples and later granite work, so while it is genuinely impressive stonework, it is not evidence on its own of a technology outside the documented Egyptian tradition. What makes the Osireion feel different is less the technical precision of any single joint and more the cumulative effect of scale, starkness, and the absence of decoration, sitting immediately behind a building that is decoration from floor to ceiling. The dating of the inscriptions is the other genuine point of interest, and this is where even the mainstream literature acknowledges some real ambiguity. Cartouches of Seti I do appear at the site, and later scholarship, including work reviewing Kenneth Kitchen's collected Ramesside inscriptions, treats these as sufficient to confidently place the building's decoration and completion in Seti's reign, with some finishing work possibly carried out under his son and successor Merneptah. But the character of some of that inscribed material, cut in places that read less like part of an original integrated decorative plan and more like additions to existing wall surfaces, is exactly the kind of visual detail that first pulled Neville and Murray toward an earlier date. Frankfurt's stratigraphic work answered the deeper question of when the structure's foundations were laid. It did not erase the fact that the decorative program on the walls looks, in places, secondary to the architecture itself, added onto a structure whose overall design already leaned toward an intentionally archaic look. Modern Egyptologists mostly read this as Seti's own architects choosing an old-fashioned aesthetic and leaving the final decorative touches for later, sometimes finished only after his death. It is a plausible answer. It is not a certainty preserved word for word in a royal decree. There is also the water itself, and this detail has genuinely changed since antiquity in a way that matters. The chamber was not built to stand permanently flooded to the depth we see it in today. Since the construction of the modern Aswan dams in the 20th century, the regional water table has risen substantially, and the flooding inside the Osireion today is measurably worse than what the ancient builders would have contended with when the structure was new. This is one of the rare places in the reference material about this site where the popular and scholarly accounts agree completely. The pool visitor's photograph now is partly a modern hydrological problem layered on top of an ancient design, not a perfect window into how the room looked or functioned in the 13th century BCE. Whether the ancient architects planned for some water as a deliberate symbolic gesture, a shallow reflecting pool representing the waters of creation, or whether they expected the chamber to remain largely dry and simply underestimated the water table of their own era, is a real open question that the evidence does not settle definitively either way. One more thread is worth pulling on, because it shows that the sense of mystery around this building is not a modern invention dreamed up for internet documentaries. The Greek geographer Strabo visited Abydos in the 1st century BCE, more than 1,000 years after Seti I's reign, and described monumental structures at the site with genuine uncertainty about who had actually built them, comparing them to other enigmatic Egyptian monuments he had heard about secondhand. By the time a well-traveled, well-read Greek scholar stood in this landscape, the true origin of at least some of what he saw at Abydos was already blurred by the sheer weight of time separating him from the builders. That tells us something honest and human about the Osireion's long afterlife. Confusion about its age did not begin with Neville in 1914 or with modern alternative history channels online. It has a documented pedigree stretching back into antiquity itself, and it says as much about how thoroughly ancient Egypt buried its own more distant past under new construction and new mythology as it does about the specific building behind Seti's temple. Put all of this together, and what you get is not a structure that defies explanation, but a structure that sits at the genuine, uncomfortable edge of what the archaeological record can and cannot tell us. We know, with a level of confidence built on physical excavation of the foundations rather than surface impression, that the Osireion was constructed during the 19th dynasty, in the same broad building campaign as the Temple of Seti I standing in front of it. We know its deliberately archaic, undecorated megalithic style was very likely a conscious design choice meant to evoke the primeval, mythic origins of the world and to honor Osiris in a manner that felt ancient even to the Egyptians who built it. We know the granite came from Aswan, that it was moved and set using engineering methods the historical record describes only in general terms rather than in step-by-step detail, and that the flooding visitors see today has been substantially worsened by changes to the Nile's hydrology in the modern era. What we do not know, and what the evidence available today cannot fully settle, is the precise sequence in which decoration was added to the walls, exactly how much of the symbolic water feature was intended from the very first stone laid, and whether every one of Seti's inscriptions were planned into the design from the outset or added, at least in part, onto a structure whose stark, older-feeling architecture was already standing. That gap between what has been proven and what remains genuinely uncertain is, in the end, the real story of the Osireion. It is not a monument built by some vanished super-civilization, and it does not require abandoning the dynastic timeline of ancient Egypt to make sense of it. But it is also not a fully solved case, tidied away by a single excavation report from 1933 and never revisited since. It is a place where two of the most careful archaeological teams of the early 20th century looked at the same stones and reached different instincts, where the correction of that early instinct came only through the harder, slower work of digging beneath the foundations rather than simply admiring the architecture above them, and where even that correction leaves real, acknowledged questions about intention, sequence, and symbolism that no single document has ever definitively answered. Perhaps that is what makes the Osireion worth standing inside at all. Not because it proves the textbooks wrong, but because it shows, in stone and standing water, exactly how much careful, patient labor it takes to tell the difference between what looks ancient and what actually is. The building's afterlife did not end with Frankfurt's excavation report either. In the decades that followed, the site became closely associated with Dorothy Eady, an Englishwoman who moved to Egypt, took the name Seti I, and spent much of her later life living near Abydos, working with the Egyptian Antiquities Service and recording temple inscriptions with a devotion few outsiders ever matched. She believed she had a personal connection to the temple and to Seti I's reign stretching back across millennia, a belief no archaeologist could verify and most did not share, but her decades of careful, unpaid documentation work at Abydos are still cited by researchers today. Her story is a reminder that the Osireion has drawn serious scholars and deeply personal devotion in equal measure, and that the line between rigorous fieldwork and private conviction has run through this site for over a century, long before any of it reached the internet. Today the Osireion remains only partially accessible, much of its lower chamber submerged for good stretches of the year, and full-scale modern excavation has been limited by exactly the water problem the ancient builders themselves may never have had to face. That means the honest answer to several of the questions this script has raised, about the precise sequence of construction, about how much of the flooding was intended from the start, is not "we do not know and cannot know," but "we do not know yet." Newer geological and hydrological surveys, along with any future opportunity to drain and study the foundations more completely, could still sharpen or revise details of Frankfurt's century-old picture. Until then, the Osireion sits exactly where it has sat for 32 centuries, half in the light of a well-documented dynasty and half in the water of a question archaeology has not finished asking. It is worth remembering, too, that the Osireion is far from the only Egyptian monument where later kings deliberately reached backward for an older look, or where a building's true age was debated before better excavations settled the matter. Egyptian builders across many periods borrowed archaic architectural language on purpose, precisely because age itself carried religious weight in a culture obsessed with continuity and the eternal. Seen in that light, the Osireion is not an isolated anomaly demanding an exotic explanation. It is one of the clearest and best preserved examples of a pattern the Egyptians practiced deliberately, a pharaoh building something new that was meant, from the very first block set in place, to feel as if it had always been there. None of this makes the Osireion any less remarkable to walk through today. Standing at the edge of that flooded hall, looking at 10 granite pillars still holding beams heavier than almost anything else surviving from the ancient world, it is easy to feel exactly what Neville and Murray felt more than a century ago, the sense that you are standing somewhere older than the neat dates in a textbook. The difference now is that later, harder work gave that feeling a documented answer, even if not every last detail of it has been nailed down. The mystery of the Osireion was never really about who built it. It was about how long it takes, and how much digging beneath the surface, before a civilization's oldest tricks of memory and design can finally be told apart from its oldest truths.